Before we begin, let me ask you something. Where are you listening to this story right now? Is it late at night, when the shadows stretch long and the house seems to breathe around you? Or maybe it's daytime, but that doesn't mean you're safe. Wherever you are, sit back, relax, and let me take you to a small, forgotten town just outside Salem, Massachusetts. It's a quiet place, the kind of town that feels like it's holding its breath, hiding something. This is where my story begins. I moved into the house a month ago. It was a Victorian relic on the edge of town, shrouded in mist every morning and surrounded by woods that seemed unnaturally dark, even during the day. My aunt had left it to me after her sudden death, a woman I'd barely known but whose absence felt strangely unsettling. The locals had called it Hollow Hall. I didn't ask why. I was eager to escape the city and its constant noise, so the house seemed perfect at first. Quiet, secluded. But within days of moving in, I realized the quiet wasn't comforting. It was oppressive. It started with the tapping. At first I thought it was nothing, just the wind rattling the old windows, or maybe a branch brushing against the siding. But it wasn't random. It came every night, always just after midnight, and always from the same spot, directly below the living room floor. I tried to ignore it, but the sound burrowed into my mind, persistent and deliberate. I would sit there, frozen in my chair, counting the seconds between each tap. 1, 2, 3. It wasn't natural. By the end of the first week, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate, convinced there had to be a logical explanation. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement. The air was different down there, heavy and damp, with a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The basement was bare, just a dirt floor and a few wooden beams that looked like they could snap under the weight of the house at any moment. But the tapping was louder now, coming from the far corner where the light barely reached. I crouched down and pressed my ear to the floorboards above me. That's when I noticed it. A tuft of something sticking up between two of the planks. I reached out, my fingers brushing against it. Hair. My breath caught. It wasn't animal fur, it was human hair, coarse and brittle, and there was no mistaking it. I stumbled back, but I couldn't leave it alone. Something compelled me to uncover what was beneath. Grabbing a crowbar from the tool shelf, I wedged it under one of the boards and pried it loose. The wood splintered, and as it came free, I saw the cavity below. Inside was a doll. It was porcelain, old and discolored, with cracks running through its face like veins. One of its eyes was missing, leaving an empty black socket that seemed to stare right through me. Its dress was tattered and stained, and yet somehow, it looked like it had been carefully placed there. I should have stopped then. I should have put the board back and walked away. But I didn't. That's when the smell hit me, something foul and decayed, like wet earth mixed with rot. And then, the temperature dropped. The air became so cold that I could see my breath clouding in front of me. The tapping stopped, but in the silence, I heard something else. A faint rustling, like fabric being dragged across the floor. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw a shadow move across the far wall. I don't remember climbing the stairs. All I know is that I was back in the living room, my heart pounding, the crowbar still clutched in my hand. I told myself it was my imagination. The house was old. It creaked and shifted. The shadow was nothing more than a trick of the light. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the tapping. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from directly beneath my bed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was under there could hear it. I didn't sleep that night. The moment the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, I got up, packed my bags, and left the house without looking back. I didn't care about the inheritance or the stories people in the town might tell. All I knew was that whatever lived in that house didn't want me there, and I wasn't going to give it another chance to show me why. Story 2. I didn't believe in ghost stories. Not until that night. I was driving home after a long shift at the hospital, taking the back roads to avoid traffic. The route was familiar. Black Hollow Road. A stretch of cracked asphalt winding through dense woods that seemed darker than the night sky itself. It wasn't a road people liked to take. Most avoided it entirely. But it was faster, and I was exhausted. The first sign that something was wrong came about 10 minutes in. My headlights caught movement up ahead, something darting across the road. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I'd ever seen. It moved too fast, its shape indistinct, like a blur of shadow. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the damp road, but by the time I stopped, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to fatigue and kept driving. The trees seemed to press closer as I went, their skeletal branches arching over the road like a tunnel. My phone had lost signal miles ago, and the only sound was the hum of my engine and the crunch of gravel beneath my tires. Then I saw the lights. At first they looked like fireflies, tiny pinpricks of golden light flickering in the darkness between the trees. But as I got closer, they grew brighter and larger, until they looked more like lanterns. They floated in the air, swaying gently, as if carried by invisible hands. I slowed the car, staring at them. There was something hypnotic about the way they moved, beckoning, drawing me in. I felt an urge to stop, to get out and follow them, though I couldn't explain why. But then, one of the lights flickered and went out. It was replaced by a shape, tall and thin, its outline barely distinguishable from the shadows. It stood there, motionless, and then another light went out. Another shape appeared, then another. Panic set in. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to hit the gas and get as far away as possible. But my body felt frozen, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The lights continued to go out, one by one, until the road ahead was plunged into darkness. That's when I saw them. They weren't shapes anymore. They were people, or at least they had been once. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, their eyes sunken hollows that seemed to swallow the light. They stood in a line across the road, staring at me, unmoving. And then, slowly, they started walking toward the car. I don't know how I managed to move, but somehow I forced my foot onto the gas pedal. The engine roared, and the car lurched forward. For a moment, I thought I'd hit them. I felt a thud as the car passed through the line of figures, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, the road was empty. I didn't stop until I reached home, and even then, I didn't feel safe. The image of those figures stayed with me, burned into my mind. But the worst part? The next morning, when I went to wash the car, I found handprints. Faint, ghostly smudges, covering the hood and windows, as if they had tried to stop me from leaving. I never took Black Hollow Road again. I hope you have liked and subscribed my channel. Now it's time for the story number 3. My sister was always the soft one, the gentle one, like sweetbread, soft and warm, melted and tender. I used to think that was her greatest strength, but now I know it was her greatest weakness. We never spoke of it directly, but there was a dark undercurrent to our lives that no one ever acknowledged, until it became unavoidable. There was always something off about our stepmother, something lurking just beneath the surface of her seemingly gentle smiles. She never raised her voice, but she didn't need to. Her eyes, sharp and cold, told me everything I needed to know. When we left, it wasn't because we wanted to. It wasn't because we had a plan or some bold desire to escape. We left because the witch, the one our father had married, left us no choice. We had no family left to turn to, no place to hide, just the woods and the promise of something better, though I knew it was all a lie. That night, the night I had meant to escape, everything went wrong. I was alone in the house when she, my sister, came running back. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and her face had paled to the color of the moon. She had been with the witch, gathering firewood, but when she returned, she came empty-handed. I couldn't understand what happened. My mind raced. Had the witch done something to her? I tried to ask, but my sister said nothing. She only looked at me, silent, her lips pressed together. There was something in her eyes, a void. Something had changed. We left the next morning. The house behind us seemed to groan as we walked away, as though it were mourning the loss of its captives. We didn't speak. We couldn't. Not as we made our way through the woods, the trees closing in around us like suffocating hands, their branches reaching down like bony fingers, brushing our skin. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence between us stretched on until it felt like a presence itself. I wanted to speak, but I didn't know what to say. Everything felt wrong, and yet nothing was said. She was different. I saw it more clearly now, like a veil had been lifted. Her movements were stiff, distant. Her once soft gaze had turned to something harder, sharper, as though her eyes had seen too much, learned too much in too short a time. I had no words to explain the coldness that ran through me as we continued forward. I tried to tell myself it was just the exhaustion, the fear, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. The forest spoke to her. The trees whispered in a language I couldn't understand. She smiled sometimes when they did, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the smile of someone who had learned to listen to things that should never be heard. When we stopped for the night beneath the shelter of an ancient oak, she hardly spoke at all. She sat with her back straight, her eyes fixed on the shadows between the trees. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. Every creak of the forest seemed to echo in my head. I kept glancing over at my sister, unable to shake the feeling that she was no longer the girl I had grown up with. By morning, when the first gray light of dawn filtered through the canopy above, she was already standing. She didn't need to say a word to me. She simply began walking, and I followed her, though my feet felt like they were dragging behind me. She knew the way. She always had. But now, it was different. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in her step. It was as if she had always known this path, and it had been waiting for her to return. The house came into view as the trees began to part, and I froze. It was our father's house, but something was different about it now. It seemed smaller, older, almost unwelcoming. When we reached the door, it swung open before we even knocked. There was our father standing there, arms wide, his face tear-streaked. He enveloped us in an embrace, and I wanted to feel relief, but I didn't. The chill that had settled in my bones only deepened as I stood there in his arms, caught in the strange, suffocating silence between us.
"I'm sorry," he whispered over and over, pulling us both in closer. "I'm so sorry. I thought you were lost. I never meant..." I could hardly listen to him. I wanted to push away from him, to run back into the woods, but my sister didn't move. She didn't flinch. Her fingers gripped mine tightly, but her face was unreadable. She stared over his shoulder, her gaze distant, as though she could already see something that I couldn't. When our father explained about our stepmother, I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. She had fallen ill. She hadn't been well for days. The physician said she might not recover, but he had been trying to care for her the best he could. "Perhaps she will recover when she sees you both," he said, smiling faintly as if trying to believe it himself. But when neither of us spoke, the smile faded, and a shadow crossed his face. "I know you're angry," he muttered, his voice breaking slightly. "I've failed you. I know. But please, you have to forgive me. I never meant for things to get this far." My sister's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Lost?" Her tone was sharp, accusatory. "We were lost?" Our father hesitated. He seemed to shrink back under her gaze, as though he couldn't meet her eyes. "Yes, he whispered. You were lost. And that was it. It was like a door opening in my mind. A flood of memories, of things I had tried to forget, rushed back. The way she had always kept us in line. The way she had kept me close. Treated me like I was something to be used. I could feel the rage stirring deep inside me. But it wasn't my rage that frightened me. It was hers. I looked at her and I saw something in her face that I couldn't place. Something cold, empty. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the room where our stepmother lay, her footsteps steady and sure. I followed her, though my heart hammered in my chest. Our stepmother lay in the bed, her skin pale and stretched too thin. She looked fragile, broken even. But when my sister knelt beside her, my heart stopped. The tenderness in my sister's touch was something I could never have imagined. She smoothed her hand over the woman's brow, murmuring something I couldn't hear. Then, without a word, she picked up one of the bottles she had taken from the witch's house and tilted it toward the sick woman's lips. I should have stopped her. I wanted to scream, to drag her away, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't move. I stood frozen in place, watching as the vial emptied, and the woman's breathing grew slower, steadier. And then my sister stood. She didn't even glance at me as she walked out of the room. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Something had changed. Something had happened. I wasn't sure what, but I knew one thing for sure. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The next day, our stepmother was no longer bedridden. She was sitting up, speaking, laughing even. She seemed full of life, almost too much life. I couldn't look at her. I couldn't stand the sight of her, not after what I had seen in my sister's eyes. "Well, my dears," she said, smiling as if nothing had happened. "What would you like for dinner? It's so good to have you back." "Sweetbread," my sister said, and her voice, though soft, sent a chill straight down my spine. I looked at her, my eyes wide, but she didn't look back. Instead, she reached across the table and took my hand in hers, squeezing it tight. Her fingers were cold, colder than they should have been. I could feel the icy grip of whatever had taken her hold of me, too. Our stepmother excused herself to the kitchen, and as the sweetbread began to bake, I felt a sickening knot form in my stomach. I could already smell it. Too sweet, too rich, like something decaying beneath the surface. When she returned, the bread was steaming, fresh from the oven, the smell cloying and thick. My sister placed the plates in front of us, and the silence that followed was unbearable. I couldn't breathe. And then it began. Our stepmother coughed once, then twice, and her face twisted in confusion. What's happening?" she stammered, looking at my sister with wide, horrified eyes. Before she could say anything more, she slumped forward. The table shook as her body convulsed, her hands clutching at the air in a futile attempt to hold on to life. Our father, too, collapsed beside her, choking on his own breath. I could feel my sister's hand squeeze mine harder, colder. And then, as the last breath escaped their bodies, my sister simply stood, her face as cold as ever. We didn't say a word as we gathered our bags. We didn't say a word as we stepped into the evening air, the silence between us thick and suffocating. "You're afraid," she said, her voice almost kind. I swallowed hard. "Yes."
She smiled, and it was as empty as the grave. "You don't need to be. I will protect."